And I believe there's a map that's to come up here in background. There we go. This here is by way of introduction to the U.S. perspective on its Arctic presence. I am not going to speak to it at any length, but I thought it's useful background for those of you who are familiar with the view from the North Pole, showing you a transshipment route from Iceland to, for example, Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands. The more important point is from the view on the ground in Alaska, we have a coastline that is 2,000 miles long along the Bering Sea, and under U.S. law, that is our definition of the Arctic. So keep that in mind when you look at the circumpolar map that shows just a little bit of Alaska up above the Arctic Circle. That's not our Arctic. Our Arctic, in fact, goes way south through the Bering Sea. And I mention that because, by way of introduction about myself, I'm a transplanted, now resident Alaskan, proudly so, citizen of Alaska, citizen of the Arctic, but of course citizen of the United States. And the Alaskan view of the Arctic is a view that is upfront, personal, and very, very intimate in the sense that it's our front porch, our backyard, our food source for all the people who live along the coast and so forth. However, keep in mind that there's a 2,000-mile stretch of coastline there with zero infrastructure. That is the challenge for the United States. Now, Admiral Papp, of course, will be telling you his views of the strategic overview of our goals with respect to the chair of the Arctic Council. I'm simply speaking as a person who lives on the ground in Alaska. So with that as background, first I have the pleasure of introducing the senior senator from the great state of Alaska, Lisa Murkowski, who's going to come up here and speak, to be followed by Admiral Papp, and then we'll all take questions.
Good morning. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you. As Alice has introduced me as the Senior Senator of Alaska, a title that I am quite honored to have, but I will give you a little bit about myself. As a born and raised Alaskan, one of my great honors was to be adopted into the Tlingit clan, an area down in Ketchikan where I was born, and given the name Anshawatki, which means Lady of the Land. And I think it goes to part of the passion that I have for my state, for Alaska, and truly the land of the Arctic, the land that makes Alaska truly an Arctic nation. President Grimson, thank you for your leadership as always. Alice, for what you have done in gathering so many together at this Arctic Circle Assembly, the opportunity to be with you in person this year at this Arctic village here in Harpa. It is indeed a pleasure. I'm pleased to be on the same panel with Admiral Papp, the United States Special Representative for the Arctic. Admiral Papp not only comes with great credentials, having served as the Commandant of our United States Coast Guard, but I think it's important to recognize that his Coast Guard career began with time spent on a Coast Guard vessel out in the Arctic, stationed out at the end of the Aleutian Islands, so he has been immersed in the Arctic for many years. Following Mr. Rigby's presentation and as part of the North American discussion, I'd like to take my time briefly here this morning to touch on a couple of issues. The first being that for as similar in mindset as the Arctic nations are, there really are two different Arctics with different sets of needs. And I was reminded of this very clearly just a few weeks ago when I was with fellow Arctic parliamentarians at the Standing Committee of the Arctic Parliamentarians in Whitehorse. And it was very clear to see the differences, the different Arctics. There is the Arctic in the Nordic nations of Norway, of Sweden, Finland, and of course here in Iceland, where the infrastructure is in place. The infrastructure is developed. There are multiple transportation options. There is reliable telecommunication. There's internet connection that is commonplace. You have access to clean drinking water, affordable energy, particularly in Iceland here, where we see not only affordable energy, but vast amounts of renewable energy. These are all facts that are part of the daily life in this northern Nordic Arctic area. But then there are the other parts of Alaska, of the Arctic. Up in Alaska, in parts of Canada, in parts of Russia, parts of Greenland, that lack so much when it comes to what we would all consider essential services and the investment that brings about these essential services. And we see that in so many parts of the Arctic, these essential services, this infrastructure, this investment is still in the very, very early stages. So it's not uncommon to hear folks from different parts of the Arctic focus on different priorities. And I think we heard a little bit of that this morning in our openings. And that is why you will hear praise from those who live in the North American Arctic for Canada's theme during its chairmanship of the Arctic Council. We heard that expressed by Mr. Rigby, particularly focusing on the development of the people of the North, and why you will hear from so many in my state as we press our U.S. State Department to include economic development and jobs for the people of the Arctic as part of the United States agenda as chair of the Arctic Council, and our support for the newly established Economic Council. For without the expansion of existing and new economic activity, it's very difficult to get to reliable transportation options, to clean and safe drinking water, to wastewater systems that are affordable, that help us reduce the incidence of disease and health complications. And certainly the issue of affordable energy. In Alaska, a state that has enormous potential for our resource development, we pay the highest energy costs of most any state in our country. And it is probably the biggest impediment to our opportunities for development or expansion. And without prospects for economic development, for jobs, it's very difficult to retain the best and the brightest in our remote communities. It's also exceptionally complicated as we deal with the high suicide rates, the domestic violence rates that we experience. Without hope for the future, our communities struggle, and many communities struggle to survive, let alone become self-reliant in a very harsh Arctic environment. So while we recognize that addressing climate change is important, it's critical, and adaptation to climate change should be a significant focus in the Arctic. There is a recognition that it can't be our sole focus. We cannot lose focus on the people of the Arctic. For just as we have a responsibility to the land in the north, just as we have a responsibility for our oceans in the north, we have a responsibility for the people of the north. And we must ensure that our initiatives do not prevent those who live in the Arctic from carefully and responsibly developing the resources that are available within their region, and thus preventing a better standard of living. Now, while there are clearly two different Arctics in terms of infrastructure and in terms of development, it truly is a region of cooperation and collaboration, and we hear these words spoken so frequently. And they're not just buzzwords, they must be real. It must be cooperation, it must be collaboration. But we focus on this because of the similarities that do bind us together. Our relatively small population base makes east-west economic interaction as important as the traditional north-south trade routes. And our common heritages and our culture bind our peoples together across political borders. And it's no coincidence that of the 6 indigenous groups who serve as permanent participants to the Arctic Council, 5 are transboundary entities with membership from multiple Arctic nations. And Alaska has ties to 4 of these groups. The United States, as I have said at the beginning and I say repeatedly, is an Arctic nation because of Alaska. But Alaska's residents are engaged in Arctic issues that go far beyond our political borders and our national priorities. I'm pleased that there are so many Alaskans who have traveled to Iceland to be part of this second assembly here at this Arctic Council. I'm also pleased to welcome a delegation from Maine. So between Alaska to the west and Maine all the way to the east, we're bookending the United States in terms of the interest and focus on Arctic issues. I continue to be asked as I travel around the United States, I continue to be asked by others, why does the Arctic matter to me if I live in Chicago or San Francisco or Miami, Florida? I think the answer to that question is contained right here. Look at the program that we have before us for these next 3 days. Look at the list of participants, representatives from some 40 different countries. The fact that we're having country presentations from Japan, from France, that we hear from Singapore, that Chancellor Merkel is on the video addressing us here this morning. The Arctic matters to the world, truly to the world. And with the upcoming U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council, it is an exciting time to be in Alaska. It's an exciting time to see the growing interest in the Arctic locally, nationally, and across our globe. And that is why I'm so pleased to be with you in person at this assembly, honored to share my thoughts, and I'm looking forward to the next step for this amazing, amazing region. Thank you.